All right. Welcome everyone to QuaranCon Cubed. That is our QuaranCon continuing content series. I couldn't come up with a less clunky name apparently, so we're just rolling with it. Anyway, and we're here with the inimitable, the greatly talented Anna Smith-Spark. And welcome, Anna. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
No. I'm just noticing that this hand, I dyed my hair last night at home, COVID dye job, and I do have a fair bit of fuchsia on my hand, so I apologize. I'll try to just gesture with my left hand, slightly less distracting. But yeah, so glad to have you here. So excited to talk to you. And I hope that everybody in the audience is just as excited. I will pull up the stream to look for comments soon. So far, we do have a few people watching, but no one has said anything yet. All right, but say hi if you're there watching, folks, and if you do have questions at the end, we would love to do that. But we're going to start with my questions, which are always a bit weird and hopefully fun. So as I have mentioned before, but I will repeat for those who are watching for the first time, in general, in preparation for these interviews, I internet stalk, with permission, the the interviewee beforehand. So that takes various forms. Often it's searching through old Facebook photos, and then sometimes it's asking what questions a person wants to be asked, or things of that nature. So Anna, I did my best to look through your old Facebook photos and see what I could find. And I've drummed up some hopefully interesting things. Certainly some quirky things. You do have some really fabulous photos in your Facebook collection. So, but to start with, there was a thing that when I first said that I asked you if you wanted to interview, you said, yeah, there's not much interesting about me except that I like to visit old churches, to visit the fonts. And and that strikes me as very interesting. So we're going to start off right with that. Tell me more about visiting old churches to visit the fonts.
Oh my goodness. Well, I just, everywhere I go anywhere, if there's a church, if there's an old church, I go and have a look inside it because, well, I mean, I live in Britain, a large number of very old churches. Mm-hmm. And it's something my parents do and I've always done. They're just really fascinating, beautiful places. I'm not religious. And actually, a friend of mine who was a kind of very non-canonical Muslim always said that I was the most religious person she'd ever met. She was very kind of spiritual. She was very interested in Sufism, and she had talked about having had supernatural experiences, meeting jinn and things. And she always said that I was the most religious person she'd ever met, in fact, even though I always tell people I'm a pantheist atheist. And have been brought up very strictly as an atheist. But my dad came out on a live poetry event that he was running the other week and suddenly announced that he's no longer an atheist. He is now, in fact, a polytheist agnostic. Which was a slightly bizarre thing to hear your dad announce live on something similar to this. He seems to have decided that now the truth is in stacks and goddesses. I don't know, but yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, these days, like you need something.
yes, that seems to be his conclusion. You need something. But I always went to. Been to an awful lot of castles and stately homes, and medieval churches because they are often actually much more interesting places. So, so I live on the kind of on the Essex border, and Essex, obviously, the great old counties of England. It was one of the great Saxon Kingdom. Yeah. This area was once part of the Danelaw, and there were some battles against the Vikings around here. The Battle of Malden took place not too far away from here. And there's a church not far from here. There's a very, very old wooden Saxon church. There are some very old Saxon churches around here. The local church has Saxon foundations. And in fact, there's a local historian who has a slightly mad theory that Harold, the last king of England, is in fact buried in the crypt of a local church because the land around here belonged to his common law wife Edith Swan Neck, and the local historian has a theory that he's actually buried there, not at Waltham Abbey.
Cool.
So yeah, there are Saxon churches around here, and one of the churches around here don't think it has anymore, but it had nailed to its door what it claimed was the skin of a Dane, as in when some of the Vikings came over to raid this area, one of them was killed, flayed him, and nailed his skin to the church door as a warning. And yeah, and you can see in one of the local museums, there's this thing, little kind of horrible looking dried sort of square of something, and it says this claimed allegedly the skin of a Dane from this church, and some of it's still there.
Wow.
And there's also there's a church not up in Suffolk that we went to a lot. We had friends who have a house in Suffolk, and there's a church there in a little village called Blytheborough, which is in the middle of it's called the Cathedral. It's usually referred to as the Cathedral of the Marshes. It's a huge church, medieval church, not Saxon later. It was built from the proceeds of the wool trade. It's this massive church in the middle of nowhere on the salt marshes, which are in fact the salt marshes that Marathon Thalia visit in the Broken Isles. The church has, in the door, there are what are claimed to be the claw marks of Black Shark, the kind of weird demonic dog of East Anglia. So there's all these legends about this huge black dog in East Anglia, and this church has a story that one Sunday, while the church service was taking place, this huge black dog appeared, ran down the church, came to the altar. When it reached the altar, being a thing of Satan, it exploded in a huge ball of lightning, leaving a great smell of sulphur behind it. And there were these great marks on the door, these black marks, which supposedly the claw marks its claws.
Well,
there's stuff like that, lots and lots of English churches. If there's they'll have a lot of them have very strange medieval carvings. So my local church, again, it has a very faded shinanagig, which for those who don't know is they seem to date back to the Celtic period, but they're medieval carvings of a woman revealing herself, let's say. Basically adopting the pose one has to adopt for a cervical smear examination. Yes.
Very good. Okay.
Really revealing herself, yes.
Just like
they're carved in above the wall, they're carved into the porch of the church. Actually, if you go into a lot of English churches, you might well be walking past a covered up or heavily chipped down carving of a woman spreading it.
Is there what's the history behind those carvings?
No one really knows. Some people say it's a medieval fertility symbol. Some people say it was just sort of some kind of warding symbol. But they're in a lot of churches if you look for them. There's a lot of really strange stuff in churches.
I wonder if it was part of, like, how there were a lot of local religious rites that were adopted by the Catholic Church to sort of like fold them in and help convert people. I mean, that symbol seems like something that would have existed in a number of other religions outside of Christianity.
Yeah, no, it's clearly it's either some kind of Celtic. It possibly is as old as some kind of Celtic fertility symbol, or it's some kind of medieval, possibly actually some kind of demonic thing. This is dangerous. It's a warning thing. It's
warning.
The worst thing. What's the most terrifying thing you can possibly think of? If you're a medieval man, it's.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yes, there's an awful lot to unpack there. Yes, or it was stonemasons thinking, "Way, the bishop doesn't know what we've got."
I like that idea. I like the idea of the stonemasons just being like, "Oh yeah, great Catholic Church, yes, very decorative. Don't look too closely."
There's all kinds of just kind of weird stuff, and what's so interesting about English churches, because of the Reformation, most of it's either been painted out or been painted out. Sometimes you can go into a little English country church and they'll have discovered at some point in the last 100 years or so, they'll have done some resummation works and discovered that if you took down some wood or if you chipped the whitewash off, there's an amazing medieval wall painting behind it. So
wow.
Yeah, I mean, there's just loads of so any kind of local folk tale, there'll be something in there will have been something carved in the church. So again, my favourite place in the world is Zenor, which is a village in it's down in the very far west of Cornwall, right at the end of the world. There's Zenor, and then there's St Just, and then there's Cape Cornwall and Land's End. It's right at the end of the known world, essentially.
Wow.
And, there's a little, and this again influenced one of the stuff about the Silky in God Broken Knives. There's a carving of a mermaid in the church. There's a really beautiful wooden pew with a mermaid carved into it. It's either inspired by, or probably more likely inspired, the story of the Zenor Mermaid, which is a story about a fisherman who, when he fell in love with a mermaid, that he found that she used to come up from the sea up a little stream, up a mill stream into the village to listen to him singing in church. And she fell in love with him and whisked him away, and he wanted to live under the sea with her. And
nice.
All this kind of stuff. Yeah, this is all this sort of stuff, and kind of So that's why I love going around churches, because there's always really strange, interesting stuff, and they're usually very beautiful buildings.
Yeah,
and this is really strange, interesting local history.
And that history is always really interesting and cool. Like I mean, especially those little stories that you don't usually find in textbooks necessarily, but that you'll run into locally in small towns.
Yeah, it's all the kind of local, weird, dark stuff that's kind of, like, I mean, think all the kind of ghost stories and things, the great kind of ghost stories, like the M.R. James, he writes endlessly about churches and things you find, because there's just so much stuff there. Just going around, I just really like things like reading gravestones and things. They're kind of just so beautiful, and they're so, there's some really interesting, there's just some stress, so they're just so beautiful, and that kind of local mark can be so beautiful. The local craftsman, it's not really big prodigious stuff, it's just a local craftsman doing something for the local family. It's just cool.
That's nice. I'm also an atheist, and I also sometimes enjoy wandering through cemeteries and doing rubbings of headstones and stuff where appropriate. I mean, it's not always an appropriate thing to do, but like there was a local cemetery in the town my mom grew up in, and we would go in there and do rubbings of the headstones of people in her family from ages ago, and that was interesting.
Yeah.
But I've always, like, when the few times I've lived in Europe, I've always appreciated how much more history there is in any single one of those buildings than in North America. And it's I mean, it's astounding, right? Because, this tiny little crumbling stone building has, thousands of years worth of history instead of just like a max of 300, it's just, if we're talking about non-Indigenous structures.
Yes, you have some amazing,
but yeah, so that's always interesting to me. So I get why you like it. The font thing in particular I found interesting, because I was wondering,
it's just, like, fonts are often, because they often stay. It's often big to move. You do often get a lot of, you'll often if a church has been heavily reconstructed, it will often still have a medieval font.
That's cool.
It's just too big to get out of there, basically.
They're large and heavy.
Yes. And because they're so solid, and they're just there. So yes.
Yeah. Also wonder how many people considered that protection from, mythical creatures at times, right? Because there's all kinds of legend around holy water and stuff. So take the font out of a church, does it lose that level of protection, or I don't know?
Yeah, they probably are. You're probably right. Yes, it's not a you want to mess with. Yeah.
Pure speculation on my part. I don't actually know, but it sounds like a good theory, right? Brilliant. Well, thank you for answering that question, because that's that sounds like a lovely bit of history that could inform so many creative choices as well in books. So ties into lots of other things we'll probably talk about in a bit. I'm going through my questions in order, even though that doesn't necessarily make the most sense. So the next question, on a very different tack is you once said in the CorinCon in a CorinCon panel that you collect spectra or spectrums. I'm not sure what, do we actually go with a Latin ending there or not? But please tell me more. Tell us more about that. You and I chatted a little bit about it before we started, but
about quite a while now. Well, in my 20s, I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia. And then more recently, I was diagnosed as on the autism spectrum. So I was, at the time, I was diagnosed as Asperger's, but now Asperger's has now ceased to exist as a term. I think it all gets terribly, because there's all the kind of complex politics, because Dr. Asperger wasn't a very nice person, let's say. People who are interested in mental capacity and mental normality in Nazi Germany, perhaps one might not be surprised that they were perhaps not the nicest people. But we were surprised recently when to discover this, apparently. It was not all sweetness and light. And some of the interest he had in diagnosing children's mental capacity was perhaps slightly more interesting than other reasons. But so Asperger's is a bit of a problematic term, although having been told at the time I was Asperger's, I really embrace it, because once someone's given you a label, and it finally makes sense of a huge amount of my life. It made so much of my life made sense to discover that I was Asperger's, but I still use it. And it's a term that makes a lot more sense to me than saying I am on the autism spectrum.
Right.
Which is just a... But yeah, no, so I'm on the autism spectrum. Interestingly, I only actually started to write after I've been diagnosed as Asperger's, having written all the time as a child, then stopped writing in my 20, sort of around 20, when I was very strongly aware that I felt very odd and uncomfortable, and there were things about me that seemed to be very different. I was finding it more and more difficult to kind of find it easy to respond to people. I'm going to close the door. Sorry, I'm in a little garden shed, and it's all terribly nice. Nice and cool with the sun, there's got the evening light and the birds, but someone's walking around in flip-flops in the next door neighbour's garden, which is...
I can't hear it. I can't hear it over here.
They can hear me is probably the thing.
Okay, whatever you're comfortable with is great.
But so I stopped writing when I was really aware when I became an adult properly that there was something odd about me. The whole notion of me going out, was that kind of university ending and realising, I had to make sense of my life as an adult to actually start doing adult things. I just found that incredibly difficult to cope with how difficult it was, and I stopped writing completely and interacting with other people more and more difficult, and then finally got diagnosed as Asperger's or autistic spectrum, and that was when I started writing. Since I was a child, that everything just kind of, it changed me so hugely to discover that about myself, for it to finally to make sense about myself. And then only last year, not even less than a year ago, it seems so long ago now, but I was finally diagnosed as being on the celiac spectrum. Which, what that actually means is I am not celiac. They gave me the blood test for celiac disorder several times, and the blood tests have always come back saying I'm entirely normal. But as I have every other sort of symptom of celiac disease, they've invented this term, the celiac spectrum, which means that I have celiac disorder. I am celiac, but I'm not. So we're not going to say I have celiac disorder. We're going to say I'm on the celiac spectrum. So when they told me this, it's like, I'm already on the autism spectrum.
How many spectra does one person need?
How many spectra can I find?
As many as it takes.
Yes, all of it. How many different spectrums can we find that account for various strange things going on about me? So I was really ill last year, and I didn't get. Last year was just written off in terms of writing because I was really ill and just in a really bad state. I collapsed on a panel at a convention. Really bizarre. Yeah, it was a panel on grimdark versus hope punk. I was sitting next to the hope punk author, who was they're an absolutely lovely person. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to vomit all over the person sitting next to me.
Oh no.
I could feel it. People in the audience you could see the colour kind of going out. It's like some kind of cartoon. You could see me going white and coming out in a cold sweat and kind of losing focus. And I was thinking, oh my God, I'm going to... And afterwards sort of thinking, I could totally have won that panel, like Grimdark versus Hope Punk. And I'm just like, I'm the Queen of Grimdark. Excuse me, I'll just vomit all over.
Take that, Hope Punk. I vomit all over you and your noble aspirations. Or whatever. Ha!
Instead, I decided that probably at the time that did not seem the best course of action.
Fair, I think.
So, Peter McLean, the author of Priest of Bones, had to carry me off stage from my bedroom where I lay in the dark and ate biscuits and recovered. But
oh, I'm sorry that happened. That's awful.
It was completely bizarre, but yeah. But after that, I finally managed to get someone to take me seriously as having maybe this was not just a kind of hysterical thing. Because I've had mental illness in the past. People, the first thing I'm always asked about anything is it must be psychosomatic. It's I feel at some points if I went in to see the doctor with like a sword sticking out my head, they'd be like,
are you sure you're not imagining it?
Yes.
Well, do you see the sword? Because if you also see the sword, I'm pretty sure I'm not imagining it. Sorry.
But yeah, so yes, but apparently I'm on the celiac spectrum, which so I'm okay. Slow, gluten free. Oh, it's really depressing, but it does help me. So.
If it helps, that's important.
And of course, I'm feeling much better now. I started feeling better in. It all really kicked in. The whole new change of diet and everything really kicked in mid-February.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was feeling better than I felt for ages. By about the beginning of March, I was really ready to start going out and partying and like.
2020, man, can just it just decided to ruin all of our plans.
Yeah.
Yeah, on so many levels. Well, I'm sorry for that. I am glad you're feeling better though, and it must. Well, I don't know if it must. Maybe it mustn't. But I would hope that actually makes quarantine a little less awful to not be feeling physically awful for reasons outside of COVID, right? Like, yes. I mean, I don't know. I feel like that would just be one more thing you'd have to deal with if you were still.
Yeah.
But then again, at least you'd be like, well, at least I'm just lying here sick and I don't have to get up. So I don't know. I don't know what the right answer to that is. That's boo. Yeah. Sorry about that. In reference though to diagnoses helping with identity and also just like a general increased feeling of well-being, I totally hear that. I had an ADD diagnosis when I was a teenager, but my family and I largely just completely ignored it because my family was like, oh, they're trying to diagnose everyone with that these days, and you're fine. We're not going to do any medication for that or anything. And it came with the diagnosis for some other learning differences and disabilities that we actually did address, but we sort of ignored the ADD part. And I kind of just muddled through and accepted that wasn't me and that I would just, work harder and everything would be fine. Which wasn't the case really. And then struggled for a really long time and had a lot of other issues. And then finally in the last couple of years was as I was reading all these articles about ADHD and adult ADHD in particular, these things are all how my brain works. Yeah. This is everything. And I've always wondered why I was so different from everyone else. And I shouldn't have wondered because I had a reason given when I was 15, but I didn't internalize it at all. And then since then I've had it diagnosed again by my doctor. And now I'm on medication for it. And just the idea of but even just before I started meds, just knowing like, okay, I have adult ADHD and that's why these things are so different and difficult. It was a huge relief. I mean, it was a huge relief just knowing that it wasn't all in my head. So anyway, it's not the same, but it's similar.
It is pretty, yeah, no, I mean, they're all just, yeah, I mean, the whole notion of a spectrum, I kind of always see it as there is just a huge spectrum of kind of the way the mind works. And yeah, it's just, unfortunately, society is set up for societies have to be set up with some kind of basic baseline for normal, this is how this society functions. It's not, because otherwise you have to have some kind of collective, okay, this is the way this society functions. But for those people who are kind of really on the edge of the way that society functions, it is really difficult. But it's kind of not society's fault, really, because I mean, you have to have it set up in some kind of way. People do have some kind of, well, these are the kind of basic assumptions about the way people think, because otherwise it's quite difficult not to function without some kind of collective. This is norm. This is the norm for how we can operate.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is having a name for what it is that means that you're sort of struggling in that and feeling slightly lost in that. It's incredible. I found it incredible and huge relief.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, particularly for women, I guess, because you're always being told things like, well, why? I was always told why. I spent years in therapy being told, why did I think that I had a problem? Why was my self-confidence so low? I thought I was obviously different and had a problem to other people. Because there's, I mean, that kind of notion that it must be some kind of sense that some kind of self-hatred that I must have this kind of problem that actually I was perfectly normal. I just thought I wasn't because I had no self-confidence. Whereas in fact, if anyone had actually started addressing what I was talking about rather than trying to find a core reason for why I actually started believing what I was talking about rather than trying to find an explanation for why I felt like that I was what I was saying.
Right.
The
assumption that what you felt was untrue rather than trying. Yes. Yeah, that's a little suspect. Right?
Yes, and it's so kind of, so sort of, it did seem to be really kind of, I don't know, I think a lot of women do have it, that kind of notion of, well, why, what was done to you, dear, that makes you think nothing of yourself rather than, I will actually listen to what you're saying.
Right.
What's actually going on. Yeah.
I feel like we could have like 10 interviews in which we just discuss internalized misogyny and the patriarchy and how it's destroyed everything. But and we can't. I mean, we can. I'm totally happy to just continue that conversation. But you've also written some books that I feel like we should talk about eventually. And I do have some really great questions about fairy houses that I feel like we should get to.
Well, the fairy houses. There's a big stately home near me called the Ends, it was very briefly a royal palace. It's massive. It was built by a guy he was Henry VIII's treasurer, and he embezzled a huge amount of money from Henry VIII and built this house. And then people started to get a bit sus about, like, hey, you built the biggest house in England. Like, where did the money for that come from then?
Not suspicious at all.
But it was so it was this massive stately home that was owned by various families, and then of course in the mid 20th century, the last family to live there, the Braybrookes, they gave the house and its immediate grounds to English heritage in lieu of death duty, which is when they introduced inheritance tax, a whole load of the big aristocratic families in England basically immediately had to give their houses to the state on someone's death of tax. But they kept the dower house and they kept all the land around. And having a lot of money and also needing to do something to get money in, the Lord Braybrook at the time was a big steam train enthusiast. So he set up his own miniature railway because he had all the money and the land. So what was he going to do? He was going to build himself his own steam railway. But then about 10 years, and so that's a tourist attraction around here. But then about 10 years ago, someone had the brilliant idea to build a fairy walk. And there's obviously people's job is now to build a fairy walk. So you every year they take it down for the winter and then they put it up again. And there are all these little fairy dolls' houses in the trees, and they're all covered in glitter and fairy lights, and they're all death furnished, and then these little fairy dolls, these really beautiful little fairy dolls, and they have little signs telling you about them. This is Titania, the queen of the fairies, and this is Pansy, and her job is to look after the unicorns and all this. And it's just absolutely so wonderful. And when the first year they started it, so everybody went, and it was a bit pathetic actually, because there were all these children who were kind of like, hey, this is quite cool, and then all these grown women, and we were all just sobbing into each other's arms. Like, you just go out to a complete stranger, just like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. And this complete stranger was like, I know. Oh God, it's so beautiful.
Hey.
They opened up a couple of weeks ago because it's outdoors. So
yeah.
I got to go out somewhere. I got to buy a ticket for somewhere and pay for it and go through a little entrance table and be somewhere outside with other people. That was like a thing.
Yay!
And it was a fairy walk. Yeah.
That sounds lovely. And sounds like
yes.
a lovely thing in these times too.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yes.
A bit of whimsy. I mean, yeah.
So it's like it's like the Lothlorien scenes in Lord of the Rings. It's like, this is naff, it's unbelievable, but at the same time, this is also genuinely the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. It's like, it's why I love fantasy. It's like, God, this is so incredibly kitsch, but yeah. It's like all those pictures of the beautiful fairy enchantress and the elven city and the unicorn, and you're like, oh my God, this is so naff, but it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen as well.
Also at the same time. That's the thing about humans, right? There are layers, lots of complexity, and things can be kitsch and also the most beautiful thing in the world at the same time. Totally fair, I think.
Yeah.
And it's important to embrace things that we love and whimsical things in times of trial. So I like that.
And I totally believed it for years. I still kind of believe that one day I'm going to find a flower fairy. I mean, I've talked about this before, how I really believe everything. I believe the matter of Britain was true. I really believe that was the skin of a Dane on that church walk door. I really believe in Black Shark. I really believe this fisherman in Zen, I really did go under with the mermaid. I really believe all of that stuff completely. I know it's completely untrue, but I totally believe it as well. And
that's why your friend thinks you're the most religious person that they've ever met.
Oh no, that was more to do with being spiritual, I think. But no, I believe all of that. I believe if I just one morning, if I go out really early and I concentrate really hard enough, I will find flower fairies in my garden, and I really truly believe that. So. Yeah.
Do you believe in a mythology of good fairies or bad fairies or a mix? Like, what?
I believe in all of it. I believe in the spooky, strange. I believe in the strange, terrible old wild hunt fairies. Really believe that, like, I really believe every Halloween. I really like this. The fairies ride. This tonight. The fairies rise. Like, and the wild hunt. I really believe in the wild hunt. I believe really, like, one day the Hollow Hills will open. One day, if I go out on Midsummer. The dawn, the other hills will open, and the other world. I believe all of that stuff. I know it's completely not true, but I totally believe it as well. And I also believe in the little flower fairies completely, even though I totally know they're not true. And I really, really like, one day I will. I'm looking out into my garden. Sorry. One day I will go out there and I will find them. They will be there. They will look just like the Cottonley fairies, and they will look just like the fairies from the flower fairy books. And
that's totally fair. I mean, the reason that I write fantasy personally is because I really want all of those things to be true, and so I make them at least true in my head and on the page, and they enjoy that. And whether or not they're actually true, I don't. My rational brain does not believe it, but part of me, deep down,
totally, if you just held it for one moment, if you just it's like that thing with the mirror. Do you ever do that thing with the mirror where you stare into the mirror and you'll be able to go through the mirror? And you're always like, if I just kept going for another, if I just held it for another moment, gone through the mirror.
Yeah.
It wasn't that, I really believe that, but everything, if I just held it for one moment, this reality would have gone. And I know none of this is true, but I really, really hold on to it as well. It's like,
if you ever disappear, I will know why. And I will remember, and I will tell people. Like, I'm sure that Anna's she's in the land of fairy.
She's done it, yeah.
Finally did it.
No, there's a wonderful book I read when I was a child called Cold Christmas, which is a sort of weird children's ghost story where there's a sort of thing about, the thing about the farm animals speak. If you go out on midnight on Christmas Eve, the farm animals speak because they will shout for joy that Jesus has been born. It's a kind of, they'll be, even the farm animals will obviously be, as they were in the manger, they will all be, pleased.
Right, sure, okay.
But, if you go out at midnight on Christmas Eve, the farm animals will speak. And there's a lovely bit in the book where they do go out, and that they're staying in this farm, and they go out and they wait. And it's that kind of, no one's quite sure, is it a minute past? Is it a minute two? One of the other children says, oh, this is boring, this is ridiculous. And the girl knows in her heart it was that boy's fault. If he hadn't spoken then, he was about to speak, but someone else interrupted, and if they just held on for a moment longer.
By that.
No, I'm a total, complete materialist atheist, but I believe all this stuff.
Hey, we contain multitudes, and that's part of it. So, I can't decide where to go from here, because I have question 3 about conventions, and I have another question about your favorite period in human history, both of which, well, let's talk about your favorite period in human history, because I actually...
that follows on probably better from... as people may have kind of gathered, I'm a historian by training, and also just by having been brought up to be interested in it, and going to a lot of historical sites. And I haven't been out of the country that much, actually. We never went on holiday abroad when I was a child. I've spent a lot of time travelling around Britain and seen a lot of places, actually in southern Britain mostly, because my mum hated the drive north because it was so long. So I know I've spent a lot of time in East Anglia and the West Country. And then I've been to Egypt, to China, but I've not I've mostly been on holiday in my own country that I know a lot of most of the mythology and legends about. And my dad was very interested in it. So spent a lot of time kind of in the places where things in British history happened. And then I studied classics at university. My PhD, my BA was in classics. So most periods of history are intrinsically interesting. I know I've read about most periods of British history, and there is no period that is not, of course, obviously intrinsically absolutely fascinating.
What's a period you keep going back to?
Yes, the periods I keep going back to are, so I have an absolute, I suppose, either Dark Age Britain, at a moment just when the Roman rule, so Roman Britain is collapsing. We're beginning to get much more contact with the rest of Northern Europe, that kind of moment of transition, that things are obviously changing. And religion, the way people are thinking about the world is obviously changing, and the society is changing. It was probably actually a very kind of brutal, frightening time to be alive. An empire was collapsing. It appears that we had a Roman currency system. The Roman currency system collapsed. It kind of there was definitely would have been a sense of end and of change and of collapse and increased danger, but that would have been it's a period because I've been brought up reading a huge number of the accounts of the Matter of Britain and the Mabinogion and things. It's always absolutely fascinated me. And and this kind of Saxon period I get more and more interested in. Actually, Anglo-Saxon culture I'm getting more and more interested in. I was very much into Celtic history, but I'm getting more and more interested in Anglo-Saxon culture and literature, particularly Anglo-Saxon literature and poetry. I mean, that would be amazing to be in a mead hall hearing someone recite Beowulf would have been quite. Well, I have heard someone recite Beowulf, but in a reproduction Saxon, actually hear someone sort of kind of been at that in that culture and actually kind of really had a sense of the differenceness and the way the world was so different would have been amazing. Bronze Age Greece would be absolutely incredible to be in. The Iliad is a book I have read. I've read versions of the Iliad since I was first reading, and my dad was reading me short versions of the Iliad. I just grew up to see again to that kind of Dark Age Greece, that we know so little about the culture, but to be in Homeric Greece would be quite incredible. A very yes, obviously Orientalist, because the impossibility of knowing is part of the fascination about the sort of Bronze Age cultures out in Central Asia. So in the Taklamakan Desert, there are these incredible, very early Bronze Age towns and Bronze Age cemeteries, and the people there have been preserved in the sand. That's these amazing natural sand mummies in these kind of vast, very remote areas of Central Asia. Obviously, we know almost nothing about, and that absolutely fascinates me. So this is like basic proto-Scythian culture, and that just absolutely fascinates me. It is totally Orientalist. It is, it is absolutely. It is the absolute romantic archaeological dream. There were Victorian, early 20th, late 19th century, early 20th century explorers, as part of the Great Game, German and English and Russian, out in the desert, what is now Western China, Tajikistan, basically kind of doing archaeology, which was in some complicated way bound up with the Great Game. I don't quite understand how people seem to felt that doing archaeology out there was somehow to do with protecting British India from the Russians advancing south, but it was in some complicated way. And they were literally discovering, in some cases, wooden statues that have been there in the desert, just there in the sand, standing there since Loch Nord dried up 3,000 years ago.
Wow.
And people left, and this stuff is just there. And of course, no one goes there.
Right.
The kind of very few people lived there because it's a desert, and the people who did live there locally would talk about these dead cities out in the desert. And but they didn't go there because they were. Why would you go? Why on earth would you go to a dead city out in the desert? You all know from fantasy novels that is just not what you do.
That's how you get eaten by dragons.
These things are there. Yeah, I mean, really, this is the people in the people in the area would talk about the dead city that the ancient dead city out there in the desert.
Right.
And some English, Russian, or German explorer would actually decide that they were going to go there. And they would go there across the desert, and several of them nearly died.
Yep.
And find a preserved city in the desert, and that has been there for so long and has been abandoned for so long that no one knows anything about the people who live there. And they a lot of them set up these great life-size sort of wooden anthropomorphic statue carvings, and we know nothing about them. And they're still there. It's just incredible. It's absolutely oh god, it's amazing. But yeah. And that kind of romanticism again. I mean, so Lost in The Empires of Dust is me writing that kind of Orientalist romance of the kind of the lost Eastern city, because that is the romance of that in European culture is so massive and so over, it is one of the great romances of European culture, that notion of the kind of lost Eastern cities.
Right.
And it's an incredibly powerful trope. But it's not, of course, it's not about, it's a cultural fantasy, and it's a European cultural fantasy about kind of ourselves, about a dream of something different. It's much more complicated than it's a way of fantasizing of othering people who happen to live further east. Of course it is, of course it's intensely politically problematic, but it's mostly actually driven by a romantic desire to talk about something which is not us, or something which is the dreams that we could have. It's that notion of travel. And of course you're traveling east because we're in Europe. You can't go west because there's an ocean. You're traveling, you're traveling across, you're setting off into a land that has no end. The vast Eurasian continent, which has no end if you're stuck in Western Europe. It appears you could virtually go on forever. And it's that dream of what could we find if we keep going. Again, if we keep going a little longer, if we just held on, if we just go across one more hill, what could we see?
Right.
And these guys actually did that. They just one more day across the desert, and what can we see? Oh my God, we can see this. We can see cemetery, which has been, we can see people who've been buried. We can see people who are virtually as fresh as if they'd been in the grave yesterday. You can see tattoos on them. You can see these guys' tattoos. You can see their hair, their skin colour.
Wow.
They've been buried in the sand for 3,000 years, and they have not been disturbed. And you go over the next hill, and you can discover them. It is breathtakingly romantic. And
it's a romantic notion, and it has its appeal. I think I remember reading all those adventure explorer type stories as a kid and thinking, oh, I want to do that. I want to go discover things that no one's seen before. Not knowing any of the sordid history behind that too, right?
Yes. But, I mean, it's that kind of
but the idea of rediscovering something that's been unknown for thousands of years. It definitely has a deep human appeal, especially if you can shed all of the colonial baggage that tends to go with it, right? Which is a kid is really easy to do, because in your head it's just that notion of discovery.
Well, of course, what's funny is that originally when you read accounts of people like Marco Polo, what he's doing, of course, is discovering. He's perfectly aware of course, is Europe's absolute backwardness compared to these places that we're going. His cities are fantastical because they're so much bigger and richer than anything that you've got in Western Europe. That's the whole point.
Right.
It's absolutely, when he talks about the absurd wealth and size of these cities and the culture of these cities and just how alien it all is. It's alien because it's bigger and richer and more vastly acculturated than what he's coming from. That's the point. The point of the Orientalist fantasy of the East originally is that it's inconceivable in its grandeur and its wealth and its sophistication compared to Western Europe. That's kind of the point that's always forgotten about this. It's only much later that it shifted. Originally, it is just the romance of, holy fuck, these guys are just on another level. It's more the kind of science fiction. You're kind of crash landed on
a way more advanced alien planet.
You're crash landed on some kind of advanced alien civilization. Narrative is what it actually begins as. It's only in the Victorian period that it becomes a fantasy of that kind of notion of the kind of notion of imperialism and feminine sort of weakness and femininity, and the idea of the East as decadent really comes in at the beginning. It's Western Europe having to face up to its own utter insignificance.
Right.
and utter poverty.
Which was apparently a pill they did not want to swallow.
Yes.
Like, no. We can't be the inferior ones. Clearly. We get this all wrong. Heathens!
Yes, well, it's, yeah, I mean, kind of, again, that kind of, yeah, the whole, that, all of that is, a lot of that kind of narrative is, again, is invented later. It's kind of, yeah, it's really, it's all, yeah, it's kind of, it's interesting. It's, yeah, the kind of history of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the history of Orientalism is fascinating in the way it is constructed.
Yeah. There's, yeah, again, a lot to unpack there if we want to take the time. We keep running back into the same themes. I wonder why.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's, yeah, I appreciate all of those eras. They all sound, I mean, equally interesting. And yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to pick a specific era of human history as if any of them are less interesting.
Yeah,
but just in terms of being a touchstone, I guess, is more like the,
yeah, no, it is that kind of deep past, because it is distant enough in time that one can never understand it. It is inevitably, it's distant enough that, and different enough. I mean, then how people were thinking in Dark Age Britain, or in sort of Saxon England, or in Bronze Age Greece, or in Bronze Age Central Asia, it is different enough in time and in culture that one can only ever create essentially fantasies about it. One can only ever create romances. No one, we just cannot know enough. There are no, you can have you cannot create, no notion of modern history is not romantic, because we've got it all, if you, modern history is fascinating and incredibly important, but for me it's that, it is the kind of, it's the absolute blurring of history, mythology, and just absolute fantasy that the ancient world has, that we know so little about it. In fact, even kind of classical Greece, actually, there's such a great deal we don't understand and cannot understand, and it's such an alien culture. In fact, the way that people are thinking is so utterly different. Absolutely, it's, people are people, but yet the culture is also so alien, and the way of this cultural language you've grown up with is so alien, and it can only ever be a fantasy. It can only ever be doing what we do, essentially, creating a romance and a fantasy. And that, I think my love of ancient history and my love of fantasy are the same thing, actually. It's just different ways of creating narratives about both about people being both absolutely universal. People are the same everywhere, but also totally different. And it's that fascinates me about the ancient past.
Yeah. I think it's a similarly fascinating aspect of science fiction too, that moving those thoughts forward in time and looking for those same threads and projecting how similar humans of a far-flung future might be and how different, and then also considering alien civilizations and what would be different about them, what would be the same, if anything. And that's where I think it gets particularly interesting in sci-fi, which I don't actually write any of at the moment, but which I often have ideas for in my head that I kind of am like, oh, I should someday. But just the thinking of that, like how in a world with completely different setup, right? Like not an Earth type world where people are breathing oxygen and living on land and building structures the way we know them. Like what are the options there? What are the ways in which an alien species could be intelligent and yet so vastly different from what we think of? And anyway, that's
the thought of doing that terrifies me, actually. I mean, I have someone like Adrian Tchaikovsky who does it really well, and isn't just doing the kind of the sort of fantasy races in space thing that Star Trek's doing. That where he's actually
humans, but slightly different, a little more skin, a little less hair.
Yes, humans but scaly, yes. And
Yeah.
that kind of, I mean, I love that stuff. And things like Babylon 5 is that kind of absurd, just fantasy. We're just doing fantasy elven races in space stuff. I know. But someone like Adrian, who's really seriously doing different notions of consciousness and different notions of sentience, that just, it fascinates me, but I wouldn't even know where to begin writing it. I just find it conceptually just kind of, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I have just awe for someone like Adrian that they can do that, because I just wouldn't wouldn't even know where to begin with that. It's kind of...
there are almost infinite options, right? So you would just have to like come up.
But it's just
one premise that you decided.
How do you really get into it? I mean, the idea how I find the notion of being able to get your mind into another way of consciousness sufficiently to override it well. I just find that how on earth you did it with the octopi and the spiders. I cannot begin to conceive of how you did that.
Well, I mean, it's the exciting thing about speculative fiction. There's all these, all those options. All right, I'm just in the interest of time and actually getting through a couple more questions. I'm going to move us on, but let's see. So this is, I think, on a related topic, but what's a place that you would love to visit? I have here, what place do you most wish to visit, but that requires singling it down. But what's a place that you would love to visit that you haven't had a chance to visit yet?
Oh my goodness. So I mean, it would have to be actually Central Asia, which is not exactly narrowing it down, because Central Asia is absolutely massive. It's no, I mean, I would. So the places I'd most like to go in the world I have not been to. I'd like to go to Orkney, Orkney is a collection of islands off. For those who don't know, it's a collection of islands off the north coast of Scotland. It seems to have been, for some slightly strange reason, it seems to have been possibly been the absolute centre of religious culture in Neolithic Britain. So they have a huge amount of Neolithic. There's a huge amount of Neolithic religious structures there. Yeah, and whole stone houses, whole stone villages have been found there, and it was important right up until the Viking period. If you get a map of Britain and Scandinavia and upside down, there's like Orkney and there's everywhere else. It's actually really, when you're in that kind of, for the Hiberno Norse, it's absolutely the centre of everything. It's like the Southend service station. It's kind of which means nothing to most of you guys, or to like LAX or something. It's absolutely actually the central hub from which all ships can go anywhere.
Gotcha.
So actually anywhere you can go there via Orkney. So I'd love to go to Orkney. It has no trees. It's absolutely beautiful barren moorland in the ocean. I would love to go to Orkney. I sent some books to someone in Orkney the other day, and she was like, "Come with jealousy." I just began the notes.
Just go hand deliver them.
Yes.
I can continue your books.
And then I would love to go to the Silk Road cities, to Samarkand, Tashkent, Bukhara. So Solest is obviously based on, again, the incredibly orientalized reading I've done about Samarkand and Tashkent and Bukhara. So things like, I mean, I talk about all the time Flecker's The Golden Road to Samarkand, which is the poem that means more to me than anything in the world. And it's not actually about Samarkand. It is the most, but it's the poem that means more to me than any other poem, I think. Well, not in the Wasteland, but it's just it is absolutely the consummate. What I was talking about earlier, it is. Flecker was a kind of was a sort of early 20th century kind of it's kind of coming out of the kind of stuff like sort of Wild and Beardsley, and he is creating an absolute romance of going to the east and finding something that is far more than kind of late Victorian, early 20th century England, and that, you know, that magic and romance and everything I've been talking about is projected to him into the notion of travelling east. And the poem encapsulates that. For me, the poem encapsulates fantasy. So I want to go to Samarkand, and it is one of the, you know, it's a breathtakingly beautiful city. It's even the great Victorian imperialists had to admit when they stood in the Registan in Samarkand that there was nothing like this. It's just, it was Tamerlane. So Tamerlane the Great, he was almost kind of embarked on a process of world conquest, partly to go and find every architect, poet, and painter in the entire Asia and put them back in Samarkand and make them build stuff. That was kind of, his thing was to get.
Look, guys, I just want everything to be pretty.
Yes,
so go find all the people to make everything pretty.
Yeah, no, it's just a kind of, it's these huge mosques and tombs and madrasas all covered in turquoise tiles in this.
Wow.
And up until very recent, it hasn't got us anymore, but it had this particular light, the golden light, which is what stuff in Broken Knives about the golden light in Solos comes from. It's the famous golden light of Samarkand. The strange effect of the dust there, which the Soviets ruined it with cotton planting. They totally ruined the entire climate system around there.
Wow.
But I'd love to go to Samarkand, a place like Bukhara and Tashkent that haven't been so restored. But and then I would love to go to this Eurasian steppe. I'd love to go the far Eurasian steppe, and then east. I'd love to go to Mongolia, outer Mongolia, to see the deer stones standing on the steppe in outer Mongolia, go up north to Lake Baikal, Lake Issyk. That's actually kind of that kind of area out of Mongolia, and then heading west. That is where, I'd love to go there. I'd just love to go there. So actually, similar landscape to Orkney, just less sea. I don't have any interest in going to any with the
hubs. You want to go see all the hubs, everything.
I want to go and see all these kind of strange, empty places that have. I want to go see the sort of the kind of empty places with this kind of intense psychic resonance for me. Oh yeah. I've been to China. I'm quarter Chinese. So again, this kind of weird, complex emotional things I have about the notion of travel to the East is heavily bound up with my own very complicated family history. My mum being Chinese, but having left, she's only been to China once on just a package tour. But very complicated family history. Her notion of herself as Chinese is incredibly important. Well, she's half Chinese. Yeah. Her notion of her Chinese identity, and her mother as Chinese, and her mother having lived in Shanghai herself as a child, is intensely important to my mum. Really bound up in her own relationship with her family and with her own kind of the incredibly complex relationship she had with her parents. So passed on to me this kind of incredibly complex. The whole notion of China for me is not about a real place. It's about intensely complicated things in my own family, in my own life, and my own feelings about my mother. So again, that kind of notion of traveling east towards China is. A therapist could probably spend a lifetime unpacking to me what the Silk Road actually means to me, what my kind of fantasies about traveling to distant places going east means. Yeah.
But also there is, in addition to that, just a general human curiosity.
Yes, just the kind of
wanderlust. Right?
Yeah. So I've been to China, I've been to Egypt. It's kind of I mean, I'd love to go to virtually it's difficult to think of anywhere in the world you wouldn't want to go, really, to see.
Right? I've been asked this question, and I'm sort of like, but everywhere?
Yes.
I've, and except for like there are large portions of the United States that I don't want to revisit, but I've been to them already, and that's why I don't want to go back. And again, complicated family history is a factor there as well. But but other than that, like I have a hard time coming up with any place in the world that I wouldn't want to visit, with the exception of, places that are particularly unsafe in a certain moment in time. But like, other than that, I'd like to see everything. It's like the whole world is amazing.
Yes, and every time you can find as soon as, if someone gave me a plane ticket anywhere in the world, I'd start reading up about the history and history and religion and literature, and just get like, oh my god, what was I thinking? This is the place. This is the
obviously,
Yes. I found Egypt very, very odd. The medieval Cairo I just found, and modern Cairo and medieval Cairo I just found breathtaking. But then going to Luxor and things, I found it very. I'd always, interestingly, before I'd been, I was always one of those people who was very kind of, Egyptian sculpture really did something to me because it was strange. It really did something for me. Kind of Assyrian sculpture, those kind of incredible sort of bird-headed odd protector figures with their handbags. I don't know where they were there with their little handbags. Something for me, but always very much. Well, Greek sculpture is just people, isn't it? I mean, how boring is that? It's just women with their kid off. I mean, how dull is that? But having actually seen Egyptian funerary stuff in situ, and you're just like, oh my god, this is just a megalomaniac. This is just horrible. This is just horrible, horrible, horrible. And I can really understand why Greek sculpture is like, hey, it's life. It's living people. It's real people with their kid off, looking, hey, look, people aren't living people, beautiful and sexy and interesting and fun, rather than, hey, it's a massive thing for someone who's dead, someone who was a king and now he's dead, and hey.
And we spent hundreds of years building this giant palace for them,
Yes, and I finally got that kind of, that sort of sense of life, art about life is rather than art about death. So Luxor is not somewhere I'd ever be interested in going back to, I think, actually. Though I was really glad I went. I mean, it was incredible.
Yeah.
I've seen the sun. Yeah, I've seen the sun set over the West Bank and Thebes, over the. It's just that was pretty incredible.
Yeah.
But it's not somewhere if you want to go back.
That's fair. I've heard that it's changed a lot. I was there in 1990, and from what I've heard from people who've gone since, that it's gotten, I mean, it was already quite touristy when we were there, and that it's gotten even more so, which I'm sure takes away from some of the awe that one might feel in that. I mean, I remember feeling, even as a 8-year-old, a distinct sense of wonder at the human achievement of building those things, even though it was done through very cruel and awful methods for very, as you mentioned, like egomaniacal reasons, just like, but holy crap, the fact that anyone pulled that off.
It is quite, yes, it is.
It's still like there's a sense of wonder to that anyway, that I still experienced there. But it's something. It feels, there's a heavy presence there, I think, like that is perhaps the ghosts of thousands of slaves objecting to the entire thing. But it felt, but there was a presence, and it was very, again, for an atheist, it was a very moving experience to be like, oh wow, there's something oppressive just about walking amongst these statues, like the valley, the city of kings, or the Valley of the Dead. It's like, I don't know how to describe it.
It is strange, the absolute the most intense feeling I had of that actually is when I went to the Vatican.
Oh yeah.
So going into St. Peter's, the feeling of just I am I'm a bug, and I'm a female bug at that. And there's a thing here that could just squash me at any moment. And that just there is some there, just that feeling of just absolute just
enormity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a sense of awe, but of the weight of the feeling of that. There's something there, the weight of it. And that was. Yeah, I would not ever want to go back to St. Peter's either. I didn't. I only went there very briefly. Just went in St. Peter's. I did not see the whole. I did not have the big tour. I did not go around the Vatican. I didn't see the ceiling, but I would never want to go back there. I'd love to go back to Rome, but I would never want to go back.
Yeah, Rome is delightful. Yeah, we actually never made it to the Vatican because it was apparently the wait times were just insane, even in again the early '90s, and we just didn't. But yeah, well, very cool. And also, I love how all of this keeps tying back in with inspiration for Empire of Dust.
That's because the books are just all of this. They're just everything. They're all just me, just like thinking it all down. It's kind of. There's no plan. There was no world building. There was no start. There was no absolutely none of that was conscious. It was just whoops, here's everything that's ever mattered to me. Whoop, and it's on the page.
Brilliant. I had nothing wrong with that. All right, it's time to get frivolous again for a minute.
Yes.
Because these are some pictures that I was truly impressed with.
Oh my goodness.
They reminded me of my time in Japan. So full dragon sculptures, silver spiked with stalactites on their heels.
Yes.
And those aren't the only, you have apparently quite the collection of amazing.
I have a very large collection of shoes, yes.
But the dragon ones in particular drew my. I'm a huge dragon fan personally, but I also have questions about how one is able to walk in these. I am perhaps more clumsy than the average person, so I would consider it a disaster. But I'm very curious. Where did you find them? How do you wear them successfully? Please tell me more about these specs.
Actually, quite comfortable. They're made. So they are in fact the basis of those is the kind of court shoes that women tend to wear in office work. They're actually a pair of very standard sort of mid-heel, the kind of heels you wear with a suit in an office work environment. But yeah, they've got a toy dragon, super blues.
We've got sorry, but yes.
They've got a model dragon glued to the front of them. They're so it's a woman called, she's on Etsy, a zombie peep show, and she does these amazing shoes. And I just, as soon as I saw those shoes, I had to have them. They're my Gen Con shoes actually. I think
nice.
The first time I wore them was at Gen Con. No, it was yes, they were my Gen Con. Yeah, they're my Gen Con shoes because they were actually quite comfortable. I mean, Gen Con being the biggest place, I think Gen Con is the single largest building I've ever been inside in my entire life.
The Indiana Convention Center?
In the Indiana Convention Center, yes. Yeah. It was really embarrassing. Various beasts, I was sort of standing there like, it's so big. And all these American people have been like, yeah, it's not, it's big, but it's not like that big. I mean, there are whole cities in England that are not as big as this building. Those are my comfortable walking around Gen Con shoes.
Brilliant.
Yes, because they are actually quite comfortable. I can't walk upstairs in them because they've got the dragon sticking out the front. So I have to walk sideways. If
you turn sideways, can you go sideways?
Even then, it's quite difficult with the wingspan.
Okay.
So they're my kind of. I have to get a lift shoe. I have to be able to get elevated shoes. But they're actually quite comfortable compared to several of my pairs of shoes.
Well, excellent.
It's kind of thing. I had actually for Gen Con, I had not realizing how big it was. I had packs for I've got pairs of shoes which haven't got heels. Cantilevered, so they haven't got heels. They haven't got a back, basically.
I've seen those. I saw pictures of those as well.
I was quite glad I did not pack those for Gen Con. I packed a pair of those for Gen Con, but I did not wear them because that would... Because
once you saw how ginormous the space was, you realized you were going to be walking through that all day. So
I sort of felt I needed some special shoes for Gen Con, and those dragon shoes just seemed perfect. I had to get them imported. They're made in America and they were shipped over. I think she's based in California, so they were shipped over. and they were held up in customs for weeks.
I'm sure they thought they were a weapon.
Yeah, well, I think because the box said shoes, and then they would have put them through the X-ray machine, and I could see them looking at the X-ray like, these are not shoes. I have no idea what they are, but they are not shoes.
A very fancy decanter, perhaps.
Yes. No, those are my quite comfortable shoes. Those are one far worse shoes than that.
So can you say the Etsy artist name if you remember one more time?
Zombie Peep Show.
Zombie Peep Show.
Zombie Peep Show. Yeah.
Okay, everyone who's watching, if you.
Yes, they are amazing, and she does some flats as well, and she does. Yeah, they are just amazing. She does one with the like little. She calls it the Madhouse's Tea Party. So there's little cupcakes and cake stands and cups of tea.
Nice.
Piled up on the shoes where the dragon would be on my shoes, and she does them with tentacles. It's like Kraken shoes. Oh, yeah. And yeah, no, they're amazing. She does kind of kitschy sort of pink and unicorny ones, and then she does like zombie corpse pride ones, and she does a kind of Day of the Dead one, and yeah, no, they are amazing.
Awesome. They sound amazing. They actually sound like the kind of thing that someone would sell at Gen Con. So hopefully
the dragon ones are popular wedding shoes, which took me slightly by surprise, because it's not the first thing I think of about how alternative my wedding might be, though. I'm struggling to think, well, what I really need, finally, the love of my life has proposed. Now, what am I going to wear on the big day? Shoes with dragons on them.
I mean, that would be how I would roll, probably. I didn't. I just wore like really basic blue shoes that I bought for $2 at a thrift shop. But I could see that.
It occurred to you. Yeah, now it has. Now you have been told that, but
I didn't know it existed, really. Like, I've known that was an option. I think I might have thought.
But the number of people who apparently think of this and search this person out, because when someone says wedding dress, they immediately think dragon shoes. It's surprisingly high.
Amazing. I love it. I mean, honestly, if that's a trend in society now, I am all for it.
Yes.
Right? That is, keep going, people. Whoever's doing that, keep it up. We need more weddings that involve dragon shoes. Come on, that's got to be a better wedding than the average wedding. Brilliant. Speaking of
shoes
sorry.
No, I was just saying the shoes are just killing me now, because everyone expects me to have bigger and bigger shoes. So it's yeah.
No, it's an endless.
People are getting a bit. I've seen those. I've seen them. What are you going to do next time? It's like, no.
Oh dear. I personally would be totally happy if you just wore the dragon ones every time. Especially now that I know they're the comfortable ones. So
I'm so looking forward to wearing them again. Oh.
Well, so that was what I had a question earlier about cons in general. Gen Con is canceled this year. It was going to be my first year going. I was so excited. But it's canceled, and but we are doing Gen Con online at the end of the month. But how have all the con cancellations affected you personally?
It's been it's so sad. So I mean, personally, the huge thing has been that so I was invited to be guest of honour at a con called Bristol Con, which is this absolutely wonderful convention in Bristol, obviously, in October, and it was going to be my first guest of honour. I mean, it was going to be me and Adrian Tchaikovsky as two guests of honour, and it was just amazing. It's one of my favourite cons, and obviously it's been cancelled. But they very kindly asked me to come back next year and be guest of honour next year, which, I mean, actually I did spend a week when they asked me to come back next year, agonising over whether I should say no, because I think it's important, particularly everything's been happening recently, that they had someone from a BAME background, guest of honour, and I was really agonising over, well, should I say no? I think you need to ask a woman from a BAME background instead.
Right.
I just sort of started thinking, well, actually, this is ridiculous, because I'm having this I'm going to have this moral dilemma about do I do the thing that I feel I should do? Then of course there are loads, and Bristol Con is quite a kind of politically aware convention. But then, of course, there are going to be loads of cons where they're going to ask a very straight white
male
bloke who writes very straight white male bloke fantasy. Hey, do you want to be a guest of honor? And they are not going to. That person is not going to have some massive soul-searching
moment of like
kind of sense where it's obviously, you know, it's going. I can see where this is going, which is just again the kind of. I mean, I'm a feminist with Asperger's. I'm a mother writing about a feminist take on fantasy and someone with Asperger's. I can see where this is going in terms of we're all going to have some. Oh no, after you! Oh no, after you!
Right, yeah.
Well, letting the people who don't think about stuff just walk straight through. I was just like, okay, maybe I should. It sounds really awful to say maybe I shouldn't be one thinking that, but what I'm trying to say is that kind of.
I totally understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I absolutely think. I mean, BristolCon's going to keep running every year, and hopefully they will be interviewing, have more and more guests of honor that are in marginalized groups that are representative. And I mean, there is always that question of am I representative enough? I mean, that's which is I don't know how you ask that question of yourself. I don't know. I don't know who's qualified to answer it, and I don't know. I get it. I would say I don't know who can answer that besides you and BristolCon, but do whatever feels right to you. I certainly think that you're a good person to have as a guest of honor. Thank you. You write beautiful prose. You write. You seem to work hard to be inclusive, and I think all of those things are important.
Well, see, I didn't actually work hard to be inclusive at all. It just
not work hard, but
just there. It was just kind of. It just sort of. Actually, I actually had no idea, and this is spoiler, but it's in the first couple of chapters of the first book. I had no idea that Orhan and Gareth had ever been. I had no idea that Orhan was gay. He just the tension just built up, and suddenly it was like, oh, so the arrangements totally make sense now. Yeah. But it's not intended in the slightest. It was just the tension was just building up between the two of them, and they that line about them having been lovers was the first time I had any idea that there was what was actually a really important part of the book. Not in terms of it being, now I'm going to give you a big speech about how gay people are perfectly nice and perfectly normal. But that sense of actually their relationship is a big part of the book. Their relationship is a big part of, it's two love stories, the story. It's them, it's Marathon Fowler and it's them. It's two different love stories, essentially, the story in so many ways. And none of that was intentional at all. What was going on between them was just totally organic and certainly completely by surprise, but just was completely natural. I suppose because I read a lot, and also, I do read a lot of classical, like people like Mary Renault who are writing in a classical world where it's completely abnormal not to have relationships with people of all three sexes, as they would consider it. Well, or all three sexes or none, as Mary Renault rather wonderfully puts it at one point. It's kind of, it did feel that kind of notion of what is it actually achieving for anyone if it gets to be the same six people all terribly politely saying, no, I think there's someone who's more representative than I am. Right. Well, there's someone else who is never going to think that, just Charles saying, hey, yeah. And kind of, it just kind of, otherwise you're getting some absurd kind of, well, I'm middle class, but I'm a woman, but I have Asperger's. But kind of, but how do I score on the diversity matrix? And just kind of,
and it's hard, and there's also some degree to which should it really even be the question that you have to ask yourself? Like, it should be the cons that are asking these questions.
And again, as I said, BristolCon kind of they do think about that carefully. They make sure they think carefully about gender balance on everything they do on all panels. I mean, obviously, kind of in a way, kind of ethnicity balance is obviously more difficult because, I mean, that can become more kind of complexly fraught in some ways, but yeah, they think very carefully about how they do things, and they're very careful never to have panels that are just a load of white chaps. Although that always sounds problematic in itself, because it's like, you know, Adrian Tchaikovsky is a cis white man, as far as I'm aware, and his, you know, what he's doing, talking about other consciousnesses, talking about the questions he's asking of humanity are so incredibly fundamentally important. Mm-hmm. He's writing about in terms of what does it mean to be human, and what does the future hold for us, and how should we relate to each other, and you're writing sympathetically and complicatingly about totally other ways of thinking and other ways of being, writing about sentient spiders in such a way that one feels an utter sense of them as different and yet as totally real and convincing, and making one think really about different ways that people might, that intelligences might think. I mean, that is so crucially important and profoundly important for anyone. And it is kind of difficult just to kind of say, well, that kind of notion of, well, he's just a white cis man, so clearly he shouldn't have a panel place, just becomes no. But it's just, I mean,
yeah, it is a complicated. Yeah. Is a complicated issue to deal with, because there is certainly a question of like, but you know, are there other writers who are also doing that you could have in addition? I mean, like, honestly, it's not to say like that he should never be on any more panels, but like, but is he you know?
Yes. Yeah. No, I know.
Populate the room with 5 Adrian Tchaikovskys, or do you want to have Adrian Tchaikovsky and then 4 other people? Of more varied backgrounds, and that seems like a reasonable.
That's obvious. It's fairly, should be the fairly different.
Yeah, so that's, and the whole thing, and that's the weird thing about guest of honors is that there's one of them, right? So you can't have.
So it can make sure it has the balance of, has at least 2, so you can make sure it has it can make sure it has more of a balance, which is
but I mean, and you could also do like 5 and then get a balance of a lot of things, right? Like I think it'd be an interesting notion to just be like, okay, these are our guests of honor, and they're, you know, and now we have this like lovely representative group of people who are all, you know, at the head of their field, instead of here's this one person who can only possibly represent their self. You're like, you know, like this is one person and they are one person. So what do you?
I think that having multiple guests of honor is a common it seems to be becoming more common. It is a really, I think it is probably the best way to go. Yeah.
It seems like a somewhat reasonable way to handle it, right? Like it should be. Anyway, but yeah, cons in general that's like the whole thing is complicated. In terms of in terms of cons working towards being more representative of humans in general, instead of the people that we traditionally think of as, you know, gaming nerds or fantasy nerds. Or
so the UK cons, I think, are very. It's interesting actually when you hear the UK cons tend to be actually very diverse and very politically aware. Certainly the ones I go to tend to be so, and I know quite a few of the people involved in programming the big UK cons, and they tend to be, I think, give actually a kind of slightly, I think they in fact give me a skewed sense of science fiction and fantasy fandom as much more progressive than it is. It comes always, every time one of those great big, so I mean, I've been on the receiving end of public stuff about, I've seen stuff said publicly about me that, my books are only published because I'm a woman. It was a publicity gimmick, because we all know that women cannot write violence. So this idea of a woman writing grimdark fantasy, it was a publicity gimmick. No one's actually read this book, have they? And, you know, I've seen that publicly said about me. I got a charming message from someone the other day.
Oh, the German dude. I saw your post.
German dude, yes, who thought what I really needed was a I mean, it was immense. I had to scroll down my phone about 4 times. With him beginning by telling me he had read many books by men, and he felt that he had never read a book by a woman, but he thought he might. He finally thought he would try reading a book by a woman, and he had heard that my book had been compared to several of the men whose books he liked, so he thought he would start. But he wanted to tell me straight off he was never going to read a book by a woman again, because clearly I am representative of every woman who has ever in the history of the universe. Yes.
We all write exactly like you.
Yes, if you don't like my book, you would not like a book by any woman ever in
No.
the entire universe. And then he proceeded to tell me it was all because I had done this false thing where I put people who didn't have white skin in it. So how totally fake is that? I'd written about these weird fake people who don't have white skin. I was like, my God, I mean, what did I think I was doing? And I've written about some women as well. I mean, my God, did I think there were women in the world? I mean,
that's crazy.
It's totally unplausible, unrealistic that people in this book, that there might be, that the idea that people might not all be white and blonde and male was just, I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it's at great length.
It's amazing how many years people can go on before they're confronted with these truths about the world.
But also it was like, because he clearly wanted me to do something about this. He clearly felt that now I have this astonishing revelation that I would do something. I don't know what he thought I would do. Go and buy up every copy of my book that exists. Can you post my book, please, Virginia?
Cancel yourself, Anna Smith Stark. Take all your books off the market. You have erred and tried to represent the world as something other than this one man's very narrow worldview, which really must just consist of the block he lives on. Wow.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, he clearly feels this. I need to do something about this. Now he has opened my eyes to the stunning reality that everybody in the entire universe is a white man. I need to do something about it. Now I've been told just how wrong.
Well, how dare you write about anyone else? Because obviously the only experience that matters is that of a white man. And a cis-het white man.
It was quite genuinely. He was like, I was being totally artificial by suggesting that there were people who didn't have white skin.
I'm actually genuinely surprised that if he has read more than one book, even by men, that he has yet to encounter other people. What?
Yes, it did feel, because he gave me his very small list of approved authors who I will not repeat. But
oh dear, I
was glad to see that most of my friends were not on that list.
That's good.
Yes, he's very, very small. His very, very small list of epic fantasy authors who are actually writing about the world as it really is.
Right. In fantasy, which is the extra weird twist, right? These fantasy authors who represent the world as it really is. Did you notice the dragons and The far less fantastical idea is that there are people that don't look like you. And then that is true and has always been true. And yet, no, but the magic and the dragons are fine. And people improperly wielding swords and spears and stuff too, right? You gotta love it when the thing that people are really on or have a hard on about is there were never gay people and there were never people of different colors and there were never all these things. But I totally don't care about the fact that this author completely miswrote the way that, feudal warfare happened, right? But it's fantasy, that's fine. You're I don't even know where to start with you. What do you even do? You're wrong on every level, and that's all I can say to you. I don't know, you know nothing about history and you know nothing about fantasy.
I have said to several female authors, and if you want to be in on this as well. So I have. It does come up, this thing about women. Women cannot write fantasy. Women cannot write epic fantasy, particularly because they can't write violence, because women don't know about blood and pain and stuff. So the next time this happens, I have said to many female authors, shall we all post pictures of tampons in response to this? Because
used ones, I assume, to just cover the blood.
Yes, because just like that kind of statement. Women don't know anything about blood. Well,
or afterbirth. Maybe we could all just take pictures of a birthing room after the fact. Personally, I mean, like, you know, I wish I don't have any pictures of the various fights that I've been in that would actually, like, yeah.
Yes.
I don't know. There are no acceptable.
But there's just no sense of that in the UK cons. I mean, I'm sure you always get a sense at UK cons that everybody is terribly we're all. In fact, we have these. Every con we have there's very often the diversity panel, which is a whole group of people saying, hey, it's really important to have diverse books, and the whole audience nodding and saying, yes, it is, isn't it? And then we come out and say, well, that was a lot of point in doing that, wasn't there, really? I mean,
yeah.
It just kind of felt, you know, there was not a particularly controversial discussion that we had there. Hey, why don't we have books with lots of different people in them? Yeah, let's do that.
Yay! Yeah.
Now, guys, because we've had that serious, complicated, and incredibly politically charged discussion.
Yeah, I mean, yes, there are layers to that too, right? I mean, you can have that very nice upbeat diversity panel.
Yes.
And then you can have but let's unpack what happens when we write about Western fantasy and stick with the tropes of supposedly medieval, but whatever. Like it's, you know, it's an endless job, right?
Yes, actually, brilliantly at Worldcon in Dublin, we brilliantly managed. We were on a panel about. It was billed as writing non-feudal fantasy systems or something. And it was actually supposed to be a very just kind of, but of course we all managed to turn it into, everyone on the panel, we all managed to turn it into a panel about how everyone ought to write fantasy set in a matriarch. It was brilliant. I couldn't know how we got managed to do that.
I hate to interrupt you, but if you look out my window, you'll see it's pouring, and I've just realized that my windows upstairs in the bedroom are open. I will be right back, but I just want the pillows and blankets to be all soggy. I'm so sorry. Please entertain people, or everyone can watch the storm, which is rather epic if you can see past the kids' illustrations.
Oh, there's there's some lockdown pictures. I'm trying to think what to do now, guys. This is really bizarre. I could sing a little song, do a little dance. Buy my book. Hey, here's one book. There's two books. There's three books. Buy my books. God, this is really weird. Help! I'm on my own. I'm going to read you the poem from the beginning of book 3. Damn it. I'm going to read you the poem. Right. Oh, you're back.
I was we have the wrong earbud.
You have some
I was not quite in time. Oh man, it's really, I don't know if you can see, but it's really blowing out there. And the rain is coming down in sheets. And and that was my husband's pillow. Whoops.
This is your pillow.
So I'm gonna have to do a tiny bit of mopping and throw that into the dryer. But anyway, I'm so sorry, everybody. I really should have, it was, a storm was in the forecast, and I should have gone and closed the windows to start with, but did not think of it. Woo! Exciting day in Virginia's house. That's okay, but I'm back.
Yes. I'm gonna have to go fairly soon because it's getting late here. It's got
we've reached the 90-minute mark, which is usually a good cutoff point. Well, I feel awful because we've barely scratched. Well, actually, that's not true. We've only done half the questions. However, we've used most of the questions that I actually had about Empire of Dust were all things that we've now talked about because they folded into the other questions about travel and about history, etc. And so I actually feel like we've mostly covered all of those things. So we're gonna do 3 quick, totally frivolous questions.
Right.
just like shotgun them here at the end and just like try to do them in like 3 minutes. And they are silly. After all of the seriousness of our earlier discussion. But if you could have any fantasy animal companion, what would it be and why?
Oh my goodness. Well, I suppose, I mean, there's big debates going on in my household at the moment about whether a dragon counts as an animal, or whether it's a mythological creature.
I mean, well, we're animals too, but.
Yes, it's that kind of, but is a dragon an animal or is it a mythological creature?
Oh, I see, yes. Well, this is a fantasy animal companion, so it can include any and all mythological creatures.
I suppose it would have to be a dragon, quite a small one, I suppose.
Go ahead.
Or the other things so there are all kinds of strange creatures in Scythian mythology, which again are completely ripped off in the Tower of Living and Dying, but there's all kinds of strange, so there's these strange image pictures you get in Scythian goldwork and in Scythian embroideries, these kind of deer, and sometimes they have human faces, or they have they're kind of huge antlers, and the antlers turn into a tree of life, or the antlers turn into raptors' head. And so, yeah, something like that. Or a hunting eagle also. That would be also be a really cool thing to have.
Very cool.
Something like that, yes.
All right, I like those answers. My other frivolous question is, which movie do you most often quote with family and friends?
Oh my goodness. See, I barely watch television.
That's all right.
Yes, I don't really, I suppose I do. I do quote Princess Bride sometimes.
Me too.
And of course, so at the moment, there is virtually every day the British government does something, and they're kind of, why do you keep using that word? I do not think it means what you think it means.
Yes. Yes, a lot of them have been surprisingly relevant these days. The Princess Bride.
Yes. They sit down and say track and we have the best track and trace system in the world. Like, why do you keep using that word? But yes, and I disturbingly have the line from La Reine Margot, which is it supposedly actually was historically said by Charles IX when supposedly when the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was ordered. He's supposed to have said, when they said to him, will you kill Coligny? Will you accept that all the Huguenot leaders will be killed? He's supposed to have said, then kill them all. And I do, again, in despair, I find myself thinking, because in the film La Reine Margot, he kind of screams it in despair. And I do find myself thinking that quite a lot at the moment as well, actually.
Slightly dark, but understandable in our current times. Okay, so I will just we have a couple quick audience questions. Actually, well, neither of them may necessarily be quick, but we'll try to do one. There's one question that was also one of my questions, which was, are you planning another book or another series for the near future? And you said you got some writing time in recently, which makes me think that you may be.
I'm right at the beginning of doing some writing. So it was really difficult for a long time, because I wrote these books, which was not, it wasn't like I had an idea for a fantasy series and I thought, this is interesting story, I will write this story and then I'll think about another idea. It was just, everything I really loved just kind of went woof into these books. They're everything I love. They're also my kind of critical commentary on fantasy. So they are very critical of fantasy. I've described them as a love letter to and a critique of epic fantasy. It wasn't like then it was like, and I'll have another interesting project I work on. It was like I've just emptied myself into these books. By the time I got to the end of The House of Sacrifice, I just emptied out everything I felt about a great number of things. So it's taken a long time to really get my head around what I'm going to do next, what I want to do next. It wasn't as simple. And then I've got this idea for this other plot and this other world. And I've done some short stories. So I've got a short story coming out in a book being published soon called Lost Gods. A little story about silkies. And again, it's very personal. It's actually a very personal just story about the ambiguity of motherhood and the complexity of motherhood and combining motherhood and professional life. And it's kind of I suppose you could bill it as a Me Too story. It's about it's about a woman in a culture in which kind of sexual violence and is kind of normalised. And the idea of consent is there's no, as there was in most of human history, particularly for upper class women, the notion of consent being a totally alien. You know, some guy wants to marry you. Well, that's what you might feel about this is neither here nor there. And the guy you've married then wants to have sex with you. Well, what you might feel about this is neither here nor there.
Right.
It's about how a woman might feel living in a world like that.
Yeah.
So that's coming out shortly.
Interesting.
Then I've just started writing something. It's kind of set in the same world, but not about, and it's very personally about women again. It's kind of, so, I mean, I suppose what I'm interested in writing about more and more is about real people. I want to do for epic fantasy what Hilary Mantel has recently done for historical fiction. I want to write something that is, it is really a literary novel about people and about women particularly, actually living, again, in a very kind of, in a patriarchal society. I mean, European medieval fantasy novels are set in an inherently misogynistic world, essentially. And fantasy novels that write outside that are wonderful. But also what interests me as a historian is writing about lived female experience in the patriarchal world. So writing actually about imagining myself, the actual lived bodily experience of a woman living within a very patriarchal, misogynistic, violent world.
Right.
And in fact, I mean, my stuff is much more kind of, it's hugely influenced by things like the Iliad. It isn't kind of high medieval at all, but it's that kind of, the Iliad is it's just it's a profoundly misogynistic world. It's a totally male world. And there are very, very, there are very few named female characters in the Iliad, and there are a lot of women in Greek mythology, but there aren't. The psychodrama is all about the men.
Right.
So it's trying to write about the lived experience of a woman in that kind of culture and what that might in fact say about women in our culture. I mean, as has been pointed out recently, since the schools closed and we all went into lockdown, mysteriously, it's not men who've been doing the homeschooling. It's certainly in Britain. I mean, there's a lot of research pointing out that it's like it's back to the 1950s for women, essentially. It's all the women I know all the mothers I know have been the ones doing 99% of the homeschooling and of the childcare, and trying to fit in their work around that, and having to, the line you constantly have to come out with is, no, I can't go to that meeting because children. Right. No, I can't get that deadline because children. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get back to you because I'm going to have to do this at 2:00 tonight because children.
Yeah.
It's a kind of standardly accepted thing. Somehow the women have been doing it. And in fact, even so a woman I know who's a very, very senior, she's been running a vast team of people in a very, very senior position out of her spare bedroom. Because, I mean, yeah, she's lucky she's got a spare bedroom, but mysteriously her husband just has the office. She cannot begin to account for it. Just sort of, day one of them both working out from home, her husband was in the office. She had to find somewhere else to work, ended up working in the spare bedroom. She's lucky she's got a spare bedroom. It's not that she's suffering, but it's just, and
but
suddenly
it's a weird default.
Yeah, she was suddenly like, well, wait, what? Why? How come? It hadn't occurred to her to challenge that obviously the husband had the office and she just found somewhere to do this incredibly high-powered job with a team of about 50 people under her, because the husband had the office, because obviously he had the office because he's the man. And yeah, I mean, the last couple of months have really shown up certain things.
Yes. There's an unfortunate light being shed on.
Yes, and so actually writing about it's not a challenge, let's say, in particular.
Right. To
Yes.
fathom what it might be like, yeah.
Yes, but I wanted to write that very kind of, because it almost seems to me that kind of, we spend a lot of time celebrating the women in history who were different. So we spend a lot of time, you know, if you read something, one of the women that people always talk about from the ancient world is Artemisia. Artemisia, who she led a small contingent of ships Persian side during the battles between the Persians and the Greeks in the Persian Wars. So we got very excited about, you know, here's a woman who went to war. But you always talk about the women who were the exceptions, the women who were doing the man things, in inverted commas. And you know, obviously, you know, it's wonderful to reclaim these women. But at the same time, it always seems to be rather unfair that, well, what, you know, the notion that every other woman until very recently in Western Europe was just either deeply unhappy in their life as essentially, yes, a wife and a mother, essentially.
Right.
In a, basically either in a subsistence household where they were working, but they're working, you know, in the household, on the kind of subsistence economy, or they are at the slightly higher, as soon as you reach the higher end of the spectrum, they are very much in a secondary role in the household. And to either say, well, either they were all deeply, deeply unhappy, but they kind of didn't work out how to express that happiness up until you get the modern suffragettes, seems to me deeply problematic.
Right. I mean, well, presumably there were a lot of day-to-day, like everyday subversions.
Yes,
but like,
or you kind of want to talk about, well, how people were actually how people were living in that culture, not in terms of they were all victims of false consciousness, or they were all somehow deeply unhappy, but somehow it wasn't until Mary Wollstonecraft that anyone kind of was able to articulate this unhappiness. Maybe they were just people dealing in different ways and dealing with this in different ways than perhaps. And seems to me it's interesting to write about people who are living in a very different world with a very, very different social ordering, but how women particularly are negotiating this, not as either totally the victims of false consciousness or as somehow unhappy in different ways they can't articulate, or the kind of, you get it in steampunk a lot often, that kind of, you know, the one woman who can see through it, the one woman who is essentially a kind of modern 20th century feminist somehow, and is always getting annoyed with everybody else.
Right.
Not if all the other women are only interested in crinolines, and then they're the one person who's kind of got it.
Yeah.
And to write in a way that isn't about that, to write very kind of honestly about women in a culture, in a very different way of thinking, and how you might articulate and negotiate that space seems to be something fundamentally quite interesting, particularly in a kind of fantasy world where you can really ramp it up with dragons and magic and kind of stuff, but the kind of articulation of how. So how does Arwen actually feel in The Lord of the Rings about the fact that her father, you know, she how does she actually feel about Aragorn?
Right.
It's kind of interesting, and a kind of an interesting thing to try and think about, because we know, you know, how does she actually feel about the fact that this man she's in love with is kind of the chosen return of the king, blah blah blah. You know, that seems to me an interesting thing to write about.
Right.
Yes, the story of Eowyn is incredibly interesting, but to write about the more passive woman and how she actually feels about her role as being the kind of her symbolic role as the bride of the return of the king also seems to be an interesting thing to write very about, and from the female perspective.
But so I also don't, it doesn't seem like it's an either or proposition, right? Like
no,
even amongst those three variations, that there would probably be a little bit of all of that, because I have a hard time imagining anyone, even just with like, so the level of patriarchy that we live under currently, I think a lot of women, even women who wouldn't consider themselves feminists, et cetera, are deeply uncomfortable with certain parts of it, and they express that in various ways, right? And not necessarily by saying this is a thing and it's part of the patriarchy and it makes me mad. Like that's not by far and away everyone's reaction to it. But they do react in some form, and it may, there's a certain amount of it is unhappiness, but people are also capable of finding contentment in a lot of things. And then the idea of, how do you deal with it? Where do you find that contentment, and where do you find your power? Like what things do you have control over that make you feel somewhat in control of your own life? Because I have a hard time fathoming people who are like, oh, it's cool, I'm just going to sit here and do all the things because
and it's that notion of how ancient Greek women clearly lived in an unbelievably misogynistic society. I mean, most of Western European misogyny is largely a product of ancient Greek misogyny, which was, the ancient Greek world was saturated in misogyny in a way that actually a lot of Asian culture at that time wasn't.
Right.
If you look at sort of Scythian culture, you look at the cultures of a lot of people, particularly the cultures of the steppe people at that time, it was actually in Celtic peoples. It was actually, there was more, women weren't equal, but it was a much less gendered, a much less patriarchal misogynistic society. Ancient Greece is actually kind of the root of a lot of that, toxic masculinity, in fact. And it actually has the same kind, that sense of freedom and democratic freedom is actually very similar to, in fact, the kind of libertarian, anti-feminist discourse that you have in America. That kind of the kind of notion of male freedom. It's
right. It's white male freedom.
Yes, the white male freedom. It's a very similar notion of that kind of notion we have of democratic Athens. It's actually a very similar discourse of white male freedom. But yet, there 50% of the population, well, probably less than 50% of the population, but slightly less than 50% of the population probably, were women.
Right.
They must have felt something. They were objectified by the culture and totally abjectified, in fact, by the culture. The famous horrifying thing that Pericles says in his famous speech to the Athenians about the war debt, this famous line, women should not be mentioned for praise or for blame. In other words, you don't talk about women at all. You don't even objectify them. You totally negate them. But there were a lot of women in Athens, right?
Yeah,
most people had wives. You exposed some daughters, but people had, there were women. And it's that, well, what was going on with them? How were they living?
Right.
And to get beyond, well, they were victims, weren't they? Well, they were living like that, quite a lot of them, for a long time. It wasn't, it's more complicated than just saying they must have all been really unhappy.
Right.
They were really unhappy, but
right.
I'm not sure, a society can't actually function with a level of unhappy. No, if all the women are just absolutely that unhappy, the society isn't actually going to function.
Right. Well, and you wonder too about miniature revolutions that never really, the stories of which never really get told, right? Because
it's that kind of what is actually going on in terms of the way people are living. That's the kind of it seems more and more interesting to write those kind of, to try and tell those kind of stories, about how women would negotiate that kind of world.
Yeah.
And epic fantasy is a very good way of doing that, because epic fantasy is often such a kind of frighteningly toxically masculine place. Interesting place to explore it.
It can be, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
when you're kind of, you're given those kind of Eowyn, you're given the kind of, well, there's Galadriel, there's Eowyn, there's Arwen, and that's basically it. Well, let's talk about what it would have been like to be one.
Right.
There's me and those two other women. How do I negotiate that? It's actually an interesting story to tell, and kind of, but in its own terms, not in terms of kind of, and now I'm going to give you a big speech about female equality.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Because it's always more fun to do things in a more subtle way.
Yes.
Or at least it's sometimes more fun. I guess sometimes it's very satisfying to just give a big lecture in front of colleagues, not necessarily in a fantasy book. I think that's the right venue for that. Well, we've now reached the 2-hour mark. I imagine you have to go.
Yes, I do have to go. I have to go to bed. Yes.
Yeah, I think we've covered the majority of the questions that showed up in the panel over here. But thank you so much for joining us. This was a delightful discussion, you know, macabre as it turned at various points, but I always enjoy that. So I found it delightful. Hopefully people viewing did too. Thanks so much to our viewers who showed up. I see that Misty306, who comes to everything for QuaranCon, is amazing. She's asking about the sweater. I'm going to have to post a link.
That's really, that was an excellent sweater.
Yeah. Yeah, anyone who wants to buy these, they're available on Teespring. I will post a link in the permanent comments under the video here, so that I just got mine recently, and now it's my new uniform. I used to wear the blazer, but now I'm gonna just always wear this. And so yeah, so huge thanks to Misty306 for always coming. Thank you to, I see James Latimer's there. Good to see you.
Oh, hi James. He's often, yeah.
Yeah, he shows up to a lot of things.
Yes.
Jessica Halsey, who I'm not personally familiar with, but she's here as well. Lovely to see you. And there have been other people on and off, I think, but those are the main people who've been commenting. Yeah, huge thank you to you for your time, especially given the fact that I know it's like your children are in bed, and that's usually prime writing time if one can grab it. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me instead. And thank you to everyone for coming to watch, and we will see everybody next week. RJ Barker's coming to chat on next Friday, so everyone make sure you come back for that. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to now end the stream, but Anna, you'll